The complexity of this project, the science of the disease, AIDS, HIV/AIDS and its history, the history of graphic and poster design, strategies of public health communications and their histories, a poster collection that spans something like 170 countries and 70 languages. Did I get that right?
130 countries, 76 languages.
130 countries, 76 languages. Thank you, Jessica. The intersectionality of race, gender, class, and sexuality, sexual orientation, social and political histories. The list continues, but I think it may be, well, certainly, I can't think of a more complicated exhibition thematically that we've had here at the Memorial Art Gallery. Donald Albrecht, the curator of the exhibition to my right, and our guest speaker today, has said somewhat ironically that he is not an expert in any of those topics, which I find endearing. He knows a lot about a lot, Donald. But what he did was assembled a blue ribbon council of volunteer advisors and experts to help guide his work in organizing this exhibition. So that entailed a kind of master strategy, right? A very robust and thoughtful, thoroughgoing strategy for taking on and meeting the challenges of the project. And so with the support of so many passionate and expert volunteers across the university and the community, this exhibition and its stunning accompanying catalog were born. I thank everyone who worked on this project, and there were a lot of people. I thank everyone for their dedication to the project, their patience, and their persistence. We had to reschedule it. Of course, COVID got in the way, lots of challenges, but we're so excited and so grateful to finally be here. There are too many people to name here, but I am nonetheless grateful to each and every one of you for your thoughtful contributions. It is a collaboration that makes this project so great and so impressive. I do believe deeply that, we're always at the MAG striving to make great exhibitions. Sometimes we do. When we collaborate with other organizations, we always seem to do something incredible, something impressive, something that we couldn't do all on our own. It's a much more difficult project when it's a collaborative project, but the rewards are typically much greater. So it was a brief conversation in 2016 between me and Dr. Marian Mavernack, my friend, the Andrew H. and Janet Dayton Neely Emeritus Dean of the University of Rochester Libraries, when we decided to ask a lot of other people to do a lot of work, right? And we sat there and had our coffee, and that was an easy decision. Thanks to everybody for hearing the call and heeding it and stepping up. As far as, I want to thank you, Marianne, for your partnership. It was absolutely crucial. And of course, we wouldn't be here without that brief conversation that has yielded so much. And so far as staff are concerned, there were a few key players that helped bring it all together. I would like to single out Jessica Locker-Feldman, Exhibits and Special Projects Manager in Rare Books, Special Collections and Preservation at the library, who oversees Dr. Atwater's AIDS poster collection. She was incredible throughout and really was instrumental in bringing the experts in the community together in so many instances. And I think it's because of all of those people's love of Jessica that we are the beneficiaries of all of that expertise. I would also just like to call out Dr. Niall Blunt, Mags McPherson Director of Academic Programs, Margot Muto, our Head of Exhibitions, and Rachel Brown, our Director of Marketing Engagement, all for doing outstanding work on this project. And I can't help but mention our amazing exhibition designer, Travis Johansson, who just knock the skin off the ball. He is incredible. All of these individuals and all of the others I referred to in my statements today labored mightily to bring Up Against the Wall to fruition. Thank you, all of you. Donald Albrecht has curated exhibitions that have ranged from overviews of cultural trends, including World War II and the American Dream, and also Greenhouse, New Directions in Sustainable Architecture and Design for the National Building Museum. Also an exhibition called the National Design Triennial for the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum in Gay Gotham, Art and Underground Culture in New York for the Museum of the City of New York. And exhibitions with deep profiles of individuals and design firms. So exhibitions called The Work of Charles and Ray Eames for the Library of Congress and Vitra Design Museum, Eero Saarinen, Shaping the Future for the Finnish Cultural Institute and the Museum of Finnish Architecture and the National Building Museum, and The High Style of Dorothy Draper for the Museum of the City of New York. He is what I would call a serious professional curator. His CV is this big, this long, and he has a kind of expertise that is rare, and that's why he was the person for this very complicated project, apparently about which he knows very little. You learned on the job. All the best curators do learn on the job. I just want to mention my late friend and mentor, the brilliant Maurice Berger, because I called him. He died early in the COVID pandemic, I'm sorry to say. But I called him as a brilliant professional and serious curator who knows a lot about a lot of the topics in this show, and I was thinking he might do it, and he said, I can't do that, but I know one person who could. And I said, who? And he said, Donald Albrecht. So that's how I got to meet Donald, and he took it on, obviously, and it's because of him that I think we have successfully wrangled the complexity of all of this into a very rich presentation, both in the book and in the space of the docent gallery. There are more essays and exhibitions and publications that Donald has worked on. He develops and edits his catalogs. He works with other writers to provide fresh critical perspectives. And his catalogs have garnered numerous awards, including the Society of Architectural Historians' Best Exhibition Catalog for his Eero Saarinen and Eames catalogs. And he has contributed essays to a number of books about architecture and design, including The Glass House Pairings and California Design, The Legacy of West Coast Craft and Style, as well as monographs on Andre Putman and Michael Gabellini, as well as the architectural firm 1100 Architecture. Donald has written extensively about the relationship between architecture and film, starting with his seminal book, Designing Dreams, Modern Architecture in the Movies. That's just a sampling, folks. He lectures frequently about architectural design. He's a fellow of the American Academy in Rome, and it is with great pleasure and pride that I introduce to you Donald Albrecht.
Thank you, Jonathan. I barely recognized myself. Who is that person? It's been a great pleasure to work on this project. And as Jonathan said, it's been challenging. Trying to find a way to take 8,000 posters and narrow them down to 165 was an effort that I worked on and had a lot of help in doing so. And today, I want to give you an overview of the exhibition. Hopefully, it provides information that may not be so readily available in the exhibition and will help you interpret to better understand and appreciate the exhibition and the complexity of the story. When I started on the project, I spoke with Douglas Crimp, a famous activist art historian who taught until he died here at University of Rochester, and he said to me, and he was very deeply involved in AIDS in the 80s. It's a contested terrain that you're dealing with in these posters. There were battles, there were arguments, there was advocacy, there were struggles. He said they are contested terrain, and try to always keep that in mind. And as I worked on the show and talked to advisors, I tried to do that, and I hope I'm able to convey that complexity and that struggle to you in this exhibition, in this lecture. I'm going to talk very briefly about the history of AIDS. There's an enormous timeline in the exhibition that gives you many more details that will allow you to kind of see how the posters work in the context of what started in the early 80s with AIDS and continues to the present day. You'll see milestones that will reflect how the posters, what the posters were responding to. But that's going to be very brief here today. I'm then going to talk about the major messages and the major aesthetic strategies. Posters are form and content, and I'm going to talk a bit of those ideas. And then the thread I'm going to try to weave is how the AIDS poster is similar to the health poster, the 150-year history of the poster, but specifically the health poster, how it draws from the strategies of the health poster, and how it diverts and deviates from the history of the health poster. So how it is both tradition and innovation at the same time as it's developed in the 1980s. I use these two images as my starting point. They're from the 1980s. One is local, one is national. On the left is an image, an article from The Empty Closet, which is a local LGBT publication here in Rochester, founded in 1971 and is thought to be the oldest continuously developed, the oldest such magazine still in production. We're losing the image. And on the right is one of the posters in action. We often talked about how in this exhibition you're seeing the posters framed and in a gallery. They were obviously almost always in the wild, and this is an example of how they were being used. This was the 1980s, but actually somewhat into the AIDS crisis, and I want to go back to the beginning to give you some kind of an overview. For it was in the spring of 1981 that the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, which we've heard a lot about over the last few years, reported on a mysterious infection that caused pneumonia in young gay men living in Los Angeles. And Dr. Michael Gottlieb, alum of the University of Rochester, was very involved at that time in this situation. It was on July 3rd of that year, 1981, that the New York Times published its first article on the illness. They reported on 41 infected gay men in New York and California and publicized this deadly new disease, which would soon be termed HIV/AIDS. Now, the disease that press coverage, such as the Times article, initially associated with others, gay men and interviewing as drug users, people who were less likely or not likely, people thought, to infect the general public, quickly changed course. It grew into a widening pandemic with hundreds, then thousands, and ultimately millions of people affected worldwide. AIDS, as many of the posters points out, AIDS does not discriminate. Consider these staggering statistics. Since 1981, when AIDS was first detected, an estimated 78 million people have become infected with HIV, and 35 million people have died of AIDS-related illnesses. Governments and global organizations continue to face challenges today. AIDS is not over. They continue to face challenges in stopping new infections and making sure that people with the disease receive treatment. So that's just a brief overview to the span of what we're talking about. Now, throughout the period, AIDS activists have spread educational messages to at-risk groups and the general public, often using use of one of visual culture's least expensive and most ephemeral material media, the poster. What I found fascinating in this show, and I think is one of the big messages, is how something so inexpensive, so throwaway, so cheap, can be so compelling and so powerful. Initially, the posters were developed by small community groups, including AIDS Rochester, which was formed very early in the disease in 1983. Gay Men's Health Crisis was formed in New York in 1982, but AIDS has been on the minds of people from Rochester from the beginning. Working from within these small groups, who were often the first to realize the power of posters, and ultimately government health departments, activists created posters that, among other messages, have targeted audiences like women. Initially, women were not thought to be susceptible to AIDS. That was proven quickly not to be the case. These posters have debunked misinformation about HIV transmission. They've urged compassion for people living with the disease. And this is a range of posters from various countries. One of the glories, as Jonathan pointed out, of this poster collection is its transnational, its international scope. And I wanted, in my case, a gay man living in New York in the 1980s, I wanted to move beyond my time and place in this exhibition. I wanted to move beyond what I knew, and was dazzled by the creativity and was buoyed by the creativity that these posters show across the world and across time. Posters like this famous one was used by ACT UP, a New York-based activist organization that was formed in 1987, and it called on people to speak out and to take action. So some of the posters provide information, call lines, correct misinformation, correct misperceptions, and some of the posters, the largest group of posters in the show, and in I think the collection, urge people to take action. Posters like this, Silence Equals Death, urge people to fight the societal and the structural causes of the spread of the disease, particularly the inaction and homophobia of government, certain religious organizations, and the high cost of drugs being produced that were very difficult to be affordable to most people. Beyond serving as public health communiques, posters, and you'll see in the exhibition, flyers, buttons, condom socks. I mean, Dr. Atwater, the great collector of this collection, collected everything relating to AIDS. He was an avid collector. So it isn't just the posters, but it's also the ephemeral material. These posters were oftentimes a rallying cry. They weren't just health communiques. They weren't just passing messages. They were a rallying cry for people, and they brought people together. They forged identity. This poster was created by a collective of a group of men and becomes, as you saw in the initial image I showed, they become a rallying cry for protests and for activism. So they forged identity. They brought people together in many ways. They were used ubiquitously everywhere. They were spread on billboards. They appeared on buses. They appeared in clubs. They appeared in doctors' offices. You were not able to get away from them. They blanketed the world. Posters with their seamless fusion of text and image have also been well suited to conveying a wide range of messages to a variety of different publics. With their international scope, strong messaging, and myriad visual languages, from simple hand drawings that look like they come from a Bible school brochure to very slick, abstract advertising that comes off of Madison Avenue, the range is remarkable in the aesthetic expression. They revived, however, the genre of the health poster and represent the HIV/AIDS poster, I think from a graphic design history, represents one of the most significant chapters in the more than 150-year history of the poster art. What is that history? Invented in the early 19th century, posters reached their modern form, the form we're talking about today, around 1880, with the introduction of a lithographic process mastered by a French artist named Jules Charest. And it allowed artists a range of different colors by registering 3 different colored stones, red, yellow, and blue, in exact registration. So by having 3 different colors and registering and overlapping them, you got a rainbow hue of colors. These pioneering posters of the 1880s sold the public on everything. They sold the public on popular entertainments like opera and cabarets and bullfights in Spain. They sold consumer products from coffee to biscuits. They became ubiquitous, and they replaced what were sometimes called they replaced what were called springboards, which were simple, mainly textual images, broadsides, They replaced what were called broadsides, which were mainly purely text and had simple linear drawings. So the pictorial repertoire was far greater in the creation of these posters that Charest created in his invention. But posters became truly potent forms of propaganda with the outbreak of World War I in 1914 in Europe and the United States. They graphically and rhetorically promoted people to hate the enemy, to buy war bonds, to save food, and in this most famous poster of Uncle Sam, to enlist in the armed forces. The war also brought about the widespread use of posters for health campaigns, to promote nursing, support aid organizations like the American Red Cross, and warn against a slew of maladies. These posters, as I mentioned a moment ago, replace other forms of visual communication, notably broadsides, which, as I said, were large sheets of paper that were predominantly text and were not as illustrative as the poster form of the 1880s. They, for centuries, though broadsides had for centuries, warned the public about threats and educated them about possible cures for such diseases as the plague and cholera. The capacity of posters to mix images and text made them a powerful and persuasive means of communicating information about a wide range of diseases and health issues throughout the 20th century. Since early in the century, health posters have addressed tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is the first infectious disease to spark nationally organized campaigns, stressing possible recovery through fresh air, rest, and healthy diets. Health posters have also targeted other diseases throughout the 20th century. They took aim at the scourge of venereal diseases and the need for sexual abstention or condoms during both World War I and World War II. They warned against the threats to the public of exposed environmental hazards, such as air pollution, asbestos, and lead paint, and they emphasized responsible action to combat them via individual, government, and corporate sponsorship and responses. Starting in the 1960s, health campaigns have fought against cigarettes as a cause for cancer, cautioning people about the hazards of smoking. So this is just a brief resume of post-tuberculosis posters and how they pick up and the kind of strategies that they use both in form and in content. Now, the advent of HIV/AIDS in the early 1980s offered new and different challenges to health poster sponsors and designers. Unlike other sexually transmitted diseases such as syphilis and gonorrhea, the existence of which and the cause of which had been known for centuries, the unexpected rapid spread of HIV/AIDS from the early 1980s on caused widespread confusion over many, many areas, many factors. There was confusion over its transmission, and the early realization that the disease was international in scope fostered thousands of posters to be produced in hundreds of countries. And as Jonathan mentioned, the Atwater collection here at the University of Rochester is about 130 countries and 70-some languages. At the same time, the international reach of the disease prompted diverse visual iconography and design styles, attuned to the cultural conditions of different countries where posters were produced. And here you see two examples. On the left is a Norwegian poster of two men in casual sexual contact. It's something which almost looks like a Bruce Weber or a Robert Mapplethorpe image. It's coming from an advertising tradition. It's drawn very much from the fact that the AIDS poster exists 20 years after the sexual revolution, whereas the poster on the right is much simpler. It's a simple line drawing. It's more didactic. It's more explicit. It's more direct. And it's asking people not to use condoms, but to say no to sex. I was lucky enough to meet Dr. Atwater's wife once, and I met Dr. Atwater himself twice. And that gave me some inclination of his interest and his affinities with these posters. And one of the things I noticed was he had an interest in posters that had a certain sense of humor. And in an article that he wrote about his collection, he talked specifically about this Icelandic poster. He pointed out that in America, posters issued by the American government were not visually striking because, he said, they had to be neutral. They had to be careful not to offend some group or some sensibility, and the best American posters were not created by the government, but were created by private organizations. But in Iceland, and he mentions this poster in particular, but in Iceland, he said, they had posters with dozens of prominent entertainers and political figures doing something silly with condoms. And then he's quoted as saying something. He said, "Can you imagine, given that these are Icelandic politicians and the prime minister, can you imagine Barbara Bush doing something silly with a condom on a poster?" It shows what people in Iceland were willing to do for the cause that people in the United States, I simply don't think were willing to do, he said. Now, in their search for visual iconography, HIV/AIDS health poster sponsors and designers found inspiration in historical public health examples, and their messaging assumed a variety of forms that HIV/AIDS posters also adopted. So this is where I want to talk about what they were similar to and what they were different from. The oldest visual tradition that the HIV/AIDS poster builds on is older than the poster art itself, and that is using specters of death and decay: skulls, skeletons, graveyards, cemeteries. They've been prevalent symbols of mortality in art for centuries. Think of Hamlet's meditation on Yorick's skull. Think of the Mexican Day of the Dead tradition. Skulls also appeared in some of the earliest French health posters of the first decades of the 20th century. This deadly image sought to warn people against the fatal consequences and the need for awareness and prevention of venereal disease. So these are posters that use scare tactics. Do this, you're going to die. And they continue to be deployed for similar campaigns during World War II. This is a French poster from the First World War. Skulls were also used in anti-cigarette campaigns. One particularly ominous poster depicting a smoking skull with the text, you can't see it here, but it's very tiny, "Have another," the skull is saying, "sure death." Similarly, an AIDS poster of a grimacing skull announces, "AIDS is not funny, but it laughs in your face." HIV posters also adopted this imagery in a variety of other ways, the scare tactic imagery. Morgue images, for example, have frequently been used to advise people against risky behavior. I noticed in looking through the collection, luckily the collection is, as you know, all digitized, so my job was made easier by being able to look at all 8,000 posters online. And I noticed certain traditions that were picked up by many different countries. This image of the morgue is picked up through a variety of countries. And if I could find examples that were not from the United States and that were therefore stressing or underscoring the international nature of Dr. Atwater's collection, I purposely chose it. Here are two examples. In one case, the toe tag says AIDS, and in the other case, it says something like, "Don't let love sweep you off your feet." AIDS posters also drew on the image of cemeteries. One poster series, this is one of a set of posters, produced by a Quebec advertising agency for the Ministry of Health and Social Services, was set in a cemetery with monuments of people rendered in stone, engaging in some of the activities that might cause AIDS, such as shooting up drugs or having unprotected sex. This is characteristic of those posters which come from advertising companies. HIV/AIDS posters use these scare tactics not only to harken back to morbid imagery of previous health posters, but also perpetuated their phobias against certain people. Wartime posters about venereal disease always blamed the woman as if the man was not involved, when obviously the man also was. So there are gender issues to many of these posters, and the AIDS poster at times picks those up. In a text written for the show, Jonathan mentioned we used advisors, and what we did was to get perspectives that were not our own, that were international. We went to 25 to 30 people, doctors, activists, scientists, designers, and we asked them to pick one poster that they were either involved in or that they wanted to comment on. In a text written for the show about these posters, Keith Monteith, who is the head of an AIDS organization in Quebec, said, "The message of these posters, quote, couldn't have been clearer or more rejected by the community of people living with AIDS." So this brings up the contested terrain idea. These were posters that said to people who had HIV/AIDS, "You're going to die," which was a very negative, not positive image, and the positive image is what should have been stressed, not the negative image many people felt. At the same time, Monteith's organization, which sought to integrate people with AIDS into their communities, not shun them, but integrate them into their communities, distributed this poster that depicted a man and a woman asleep in a coffin with the tagline, "AIDS does not forgive." The poster, he writes, and this is the kind of controversies that exist around these posters, that he himself commissioned. The posters, he writes, reinforced the death message and further stymied the fight for inclusion. The poster was created by an ad agency, he says, and for that reason, from then on in, Monteith's organization never used an ad campaign, never outsourced the posters, but always worked, if they did have an advertising agency, with getting them involved. So they really tried hard not to lose control of the content and the meaning. Now, while overt icons of death and decay, such as skulls, coffins, and cemeteries, have made frequent appearances in the visual repertoire of public health posters, their opposite, vibrant and healthy bodies, have also been present. And a main theme that you'll see, and this is on the right, is a World War II American poster. She may look clean, but pickups, good time girls, and prostitutes spread syphilis and gonorrhea. Again, this is a gender norm that we see today. As I said a minute ago, the men were just as involved as the women, but the women were the ones who were castigated. At the same time, there were posters that AIDS posters picked up on this theme. This British poster on the left has a man saying, "She looks safe," and the woman is saying, "I can't stop now anyway." So in other words, there is a trope, a visual trope. The body may look healthy, but could be hiding the disease. Another public health message has focused on the need to protect the innocent victims of the disease. You may get it and you may become ill, but you have to protect your family. You have to show personal responsibility, especially towards children and young people and your family. Educational campaigns about the negative effects of smoking, air pollution, and lead paint often use the imagery of children, as you see on the right, pregnant women and families, aiming to convince adults and policymakers to act responsibly in order to not affect the health of others with their actions. Public health posters have endorsed compassion for people infected with the disease, with images of them being cared for or asking for care. There's a wonderful quote in the exhibition by Princess Diana about who was, you may remember, she went to an AIDS hospital and hugged and embraced somebody. This was a very big piece of misinformation that simply contact with an AIDS person could cause you to get AIDS. She fought against that, and many posters fight against that as well. On the right is a World War I poster about tuberculosis, and a caring hand comes from without the frame. The same way this African poster has the image, even with AIDS, we care for you. And the use of the hand is a very potent metaphor that the touch of one person onto the AIDS patient says a lot, and many of the posters I've noticed, and these are just two examples, many of the posters use this hand imagery. This is a poster from 1987. It's a child and a childlike drawing. It's an 87 poster rendered as a stick figure drawing showing a child crying, "I have AIDS, please hug me, I can't make you sick." This poster was most likely sparked by a debate that you may remember. An Indiana teenager named Ryan White came down with AIDS. He was a hemophiliac. He came down with AIDS and was precluded from entering his school. And he fought back. It became national news in the mid-1980s. He fought back and was readmitted to his school because he couldn't give people AIDS. But that was the kind of fear that these posters are responding to. And this poster is possibly a response to that. More visually sophisticated was this poster created for the Italian clothing company Benetton that evoked the image of a dying Christ in its photograph of a young man, his body ravaged by AIDS on his deathbed, surrounded by his distraught family, whose embraces comfort him and each other. So again, the hand imagery, the touch, is very, very potent in these posters. In one of the commentaries in the show, in this poster, there's a wonderful AIDS activist named Ted Carr, who was speaking here at the symposium in 2 weeks. And he did enough research to discover she's off frame, but if you look, your eye on this poster is focused on the dying figure. His name is David Kirby, and his family. But if you look to the left, there is another hand coming from off the frame. That is a caregiver named Peta, who is embracing David Kirby and who allowed the photographer, Therese Frere, to take this photograph, which originally appeared in Life magazine before it was used for this Benetton ad. And Ted writes about this poster, "Let Peta's wrist and spirit encourage viewers to look beyond the poster frame searching for the stories untold and the context needed to better understand the history and ongoingness of HIV/AIDS. Now, one of the things I learned from Dr. Atwater was he had a real affinity, as I mentioned earlier, but I'm going to talk a little more about it, for posters that had a kind of literary edge, that were humorous, that had puns, that were ironic. And that is surprisingly a history of the health poster. You would think that a disease would not spawn posters that had jokes, but there were such posters, and it's another one of those traditions, along with the scare tactics, along with the warm embraces of the hand, the showing compassion. It's one of the traditions of the health posters that the AIDS poster picks up on. This is an anti-cigarette poster and from the American Cancer Society, and it's a pun, lady killer. The lady killer is normally a handsome man who woos the woman, but in this case, as you'll read by the tagline, the lady killer is the cigarette and actually kills the lady literally, not figuratively. This needs no explanation. Edward Atwater talked a lot about this poster. It uses this approach. It's a colorful pairing of a man and a woman locked in a sexual position in the style of the Hindu Kama Sutra. And it says, if you think this looks dangerous, try it without a condom. This needs even less explanation. A pair of Canadian posters punned on slang expression for female and male genitalia. This one he talked about every time I saw him twice only. He mentioned this one, and there's another one coming in a second. And I just found it interesting that he had an affinity for these edgy posters. Because he said to me, it was a very serious condition, but don't lose sight that there was humor and irony and beauty at times. This is another poster which he liked. You read the top, Vanessa was in a fatal car accident last night, only she doesn't know it yet. Well, how does she not know it if you're in a car crash? Well, she doesn't know it because if you read the tagline, she's had unprotected sex because she's had drugs and she's gotten AIDS from the male partner. So again, and these posters require a double take. Remember, we have a very crowded visual landscape in the West. And so these posters had to break through in some way, either graphically or through some clever tagline that comes from, in a sense, advertising. Now, the area where the AIDS poster deviates from the other health posters that it builds on is in the open depiction of sexual activity. And as I mentioned earlier, this is largely a function of the West. African countries, Muslim countries do not tend to use this kind of imagery, but in the West, this was a famous campaign, Safe Sex is Hot Sex, where the nudity, the expression of open sexuality, is one of the ways in which the AIDS poster deviates and defines itself as being different from the health poster. Art is a source of a lot of the AIDS posters, and this was an early poster. I think this is the earliest poster in the show. It was created by AIDS Rochester in 1983, and Dr. Bill Valenti, who helped found AIDS Rochester and which is now Trillium Health, was telling me that they were so active at the time that they had no idea who created the poster. They don't know who designed this, but he remembers it being designed. It's taken from an Andy Warhol cover of an album from the Velvet Underground, and it was to show men how to use a condom, which I guess was not that readily understandable. And this was ubiquitous around the Rochester area. Some of these posters also drew on the visual traditions of their home countries. And the the posters that deals with the condom, just as the poster that is sexually frank, the poster that deals with the condom becomes very prevalent. And that actually sparked Dr. Edward Atwater's collection, a poster with a condom, as we point out in the exhibition. And I have to thank Jessica Locker-Feldman, who actually found the poster. He talked, when he was asked why he started to collect AIDS posters, he says that as a young student at Harvard Medical School, they taught us about sex behind closed doors, and they barely ever mentioned a condom. It was very hush-hush. Around 1990, he went back to the Boston area to a conference at Harvard and was shocked at seeing a poster of condom use, very open and very vivid. So it was part of the sexual frankness of the AIDS poster. It was not just sexual activity, but the overt depiction of condoms and in various manifestations. And he was so surprised at how medical representation and imagery had changed over the 30 years since he had gone to school, that it sparked his interest. He wrote to the Massachusetts Health Department after the poster, and 30 years later, University of Rochester has one of the greatest, if not the greatest, collection of AIDS posters. But it was this open depiction of condoms that sparked the collection we're here to celebrate. Different countries draw on different traditions. On the left is a poster from Morocco. On the right is a spoof on that World War I poster that I showed you of Uncle Sam, I want you not now to enlist, but to use condoms. This is a visual trope that repeats throughout the collection. It's a spoof on Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, where man and God are about to meet, and in this case, God is giving man, we assume, it's God giving man a condom to use. And you find this ubiquitous throughout the collection, and I picked one from the United States on the left, and I found this really beautiful one from Brazil. This is a Swiss campaign that is, again, undidactic. It's implicit, what it's telling you. It simply uses the condom as the letter O in the words tonight, okay. There's another one called bravo. We picked 3 for this. So it's very implicit. It's not didactic. And it was created by an advertising agency. There are even posters of animated cartoon-like characters, like this one from Hong Kong. And a campaign featuring a man named Condo Man. It targeted Aboriginal men in Australia for whom wearing a condom was often a cultural stigma. So this was targeted to a very specific audience that was resistant to condom use, and it's a cartoon character. This diversity of design expression supports something that a theorist named Paula Teichler contended, that health posters, HIV/AIDS posters promoted condoms, she said, follow generic templates. They were created on the ground and most likely to embrace a country's cultural norms. So they're always shifting based on the grounds they live in. It's a strategy that she calls think globally, screw locally. Today, the poster still plays a role in HIV awareness and prevention, but its messages, its imagery, and its delivery systems have changed with the times. Remember, the posters in the exhibition are all analog. They're not digital. Contemporary posters promote the most up-to-date science to an audience that has been surrounded by HIV/AIDS messaging for decades. So we're now up to 40 years in, and therefore the messages have to change. Also, the disease is no longer a near-death sentence, but a manageable chronic condition. At the same time, posters based on the imagery and rhetoric of fear and scare tactics have largely disappeared. We don't know if they ever worked, but they have largely disappeared. It's a much more positive set of messages now. Sexuality and sexual differences are depicted even more openly now than they were in the 80s, 90s, and aughts. Changes in messaging and imagery have been matched by transformations in how people encounter HIV posters. Still seen on the streets and subways, posters now freely circulate on websites and social media, and they pop up on smartphones and mobile devices. They change with the time. HIV poster making will thus continue. HIV posters will morph in lockstep with medical advances in knowledge and perceptions of HIV/AIDS until the disease is hopefully delivered. At that hoped-for time, the HIV/AIDS poster will enter the history books. It will comprise a dynamic chapter in the trajectory of the health poster, both building on tradition and adding to it in creative and dynamic ways. Thank you. I know there are maybe some questions. I always like to mention that I'm not a doctor and I'm not a scientist. You know, as Jonathan said, I'm an expert in some things, but I'm really not an expert in science otherwise. Are there any questions?
Welcome. It was a wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
One of the earlier posters that you showed had a red triangle. And
Yes.
I was wondering what that symbolism meant.
Yes. The pink triangle was what, and they overtly knew this, the pink triangle was used to define homosexuals in Nazi prison camps. And so the designers of that poster, which is, it was a collective headed by a man named Avram Finkelstein, who is speaking here at the Neely Lecture in about 2 weeks. And yes, they were quite aware of the potency of that symbol and the stigma attached, the power of it, and that gay men, at that time it was largely gay men and women, but it was largely gay men they were talking to. They understood that the stigmatization of homosexuals was similar or akin to the stigma against Jews during the Second World War, so they purposely chose that image. That poster took about 6 months to design. They had big debates. He's going to talk about this in 2 weeks. They had big debates about whether such a potent image should be used. As I mentioned, with the images of the caskets and Keith Monteith not wanting to use it, there's always been a question of should the imagery be so negative and so pessimistic. They had big debates over it. They finished it December of 1986, and it was wheat pasted throughout New York starting in February of 87, and it was adopted by ACT UP. So it's famous in its history of graphic design, but it's woven into the activist history, and Avram is going to be talking about it.
I have one other question, if I may. Are you aware of when or if Rochester had a large HIV community?
Well, AIDS Rochester was formed in 1983. So very early on, Rochester has been very active. Does somebody else, there are people here from Rochester who know that? Yes. I know Rochester's been very active, but yes, I'm not a Rochester resident, so. Do you have comments on that?
Oh my God, yes, it was a horrendous time. We buried all of our friends. Probably half of my friends we buried.
Yeah.
It was a horrible time, but we were very active. AIDS Rochester, helping people with AIDS. We met people, we clothed them, we found them housing. We took care of people medically. Yeah, it was a very grassroots effort.
Right.
Not well organized, but well intentioned, and we did the best we could. But it was horrific.
It was chaotic, yes. That's what
it was
built.
chaotic, but but we were doing We didn't know what we were doing, but we knew we had to keep people at
Right.
least clothed and housed and fed. And, you know, Bill and his team did the best they could over there. So yeah, it was a big deal, huge. We
Yes.
had, one of the things that we did, I think that was most significant is we enlisted our straight allies. We had dinners called Dining for Dollars, and we would have house parties and invite our straight friends to come and then go to a party afterwards and they'd give us money. That's what we did.
Yeah.
It was a big deal.
No, actually, I mean, one of the things I'm hoping this exhibition teaches people, and especially young people, is how something so inexpensive and throwaway as the poster can spur people to action, and how it spurred people to action then, and maybe it can spur people to action today, that the means to affect change can be very simple. And what the gentleman just said, I remember it also from, I worked at Gay Men's Health Crisis volunteering. No one knew what was going on, but we knew we had to do something. And that's why the smallest groups of people who were affected were the first, and then city governments, the World Health Organization, they become involved later. But it's the activist groups like AIDS Rochester that were really at the forefront, because they were organizations of people who were most affected.
I have a question. Hi. Well, I have two questions, actually. The first one is, as curator, do you have like an overarching message that you're wanting to get across through this exhibition, other than celebratory or historical in terms of showing these posters and the history that you've outlined? And then also, my second question is, in terms of the layout of the exhibition, what were those considerations, like in terms of like, are they organized from a historical timeline? Is it country by country? So,
I'll answer the second question first. There is a book in conjunction with the exhibition, and the book is easy to understand its organization. It tends to be page 1, page 2, page 3. An exhibition can't do that. And so Travis Johansson, who Jonathan mentioned, is the designer of the show, and he laid my themes out in a spatial way. And that required subdivision. So there's a section on women and AIDS, the posters. There's a section on that AIDS is a global threat. The overall organization, the posters fall into two buckets and lots of subsets. One is what I would call posters that are trying to raise awareness, which was very characteristic of the early days. Places you could call to get help. How you got AIDS, how you didn't get AIDS. AIDS affected everybody, it didn't discriminate. And then the second bucket, shall we call it, are posters that actually urge action. And that's where like ACT UP comes in. Wearing condoms, using clean needles, showing compassion. So it's changes in perceptions and changes in behavior is how the posters are broadly organized. But in an exhibition, you're going through space and you have walls. You have to subdivide it. And so the museum, which was a great partner in working on this, added subheadings, graphics, and they added these quotes from Annie Lennox and the Princess of Wales, that Elton John, Kofi Annan, that really, I think, helped the interpretation, and then we created a timeline. So in translating it from an exhibition to a show, we rely on the designers to do that. And there's a very good one here who I think really laid it out in an understandable way. Then there's a small section on Dr. Atwater and his collection, and a small section on the history. What I talked about today is actually a small section in the show, and I thought maybe that's what I could contribute in this lecture, was to blow that out a bit more. What I hope people take away from the power of something so simple to affect major change. That it's doable, that these were created by local organizations, they cost nothing, they brought people together, and they affected change, and they did so with very simple means. That's a big message that I don't know if I don't know if an exhibition can do that, but I'm hoping it can.
I wanted to add on to what, I agree with what Bruce said, that during that time, Community Health Network was the medical clinic that worked with AIDS Rochester, and we did all those benefits for Dining for Dollars and all that kind of stuff, and we all worked together to make sure that the patients that came in were able to get not only medical care,
Yeah.
but food, water, shelter, and all that stuff. So
Yeah.
it was very important to have that
Right, yeah,
collaborative
definitely.
effect. But the name of the clinic,
Yeah.
now it's Trillium, was Community Health Network.
Right, right.
I was their second nurse 100 years ago.
No, you know.
Thank you so much for this
No, another
presentation
another
as well.
message is, again, I want to move, I think many of us, I myself, but I think many other people believe that AIDS is over, that it was something of the 1980s, that was in New York, that it was in San Francisco, and to broaden that scope, to understand that it was international, that it affected people all over the world, that people responded in different ways, graphically and in content and in messaging. That, I think, is another message. That's probably more of an arcane message, a message that has to do with graphic design and the power of design. But that's another message that I learned, and I was dazzled in going through the posters to move beyond my own narrow view. In fact, the last poster in the show is by a young scholar named Ian Bradley Perrin, who lives in New York but is Canadian. And it's called Your Nostalgia is Killing Me. And it's a poster he created, and if you look, the nostalgia is the nostalgia that many gay men of the 80s suffer from thinking that our situation was worse than anybody else's. And that nostalgia, as Ian says in the poster, is killing me. He meant Avram Finkelstein in some ways, and they've had a very spirited debate over that poster. Because he asked Avram to come to Montreal to give a lecture, and he used that as the poster. So there are generational changes and perceptions that are happening, and to try to move beyond the confines of Silence Equals Death, ACT UP, Larry Kramer, New York City, 1980, to move beyond that, I think is really significant in what I tried to do. Or it's significant to do that. And this is just a maiden voyage. I mean, already there have been smaller exhibitions about these posters. They'll be used for teaching. They can be the source of articles. They can be the source of other books, other symposia. You know, it's a rich resource that has lots of life in it. In fact, that we, like I said a minute ago, the fact that we couldn't organize the show chronologically is because if you look, I'm sorry to admit, I tried to find as many dates. I worked with the designers of the book to get as close as I could get if I could find a date. Many of the posters are not dated. And simply, I have to admit, I couldn't find myself trying to reach the Nairobi Health Department to say, when did you produce that poster? I just didn't think that was likely, you know. So that's why another reason we didn't order it chronologically, and that's why we have a timeline that does provide, and you can see the synergy. You know, the World Health Organization announces it's global in about 85. You get a lot of posters that say it's global in about 85. That's why. The Surgeon General, Coop, talks about condoms being the best source, 85, 86. Bingo, that's when you get a lot of posters.
So I don't know if this is as much a question as an observation, but one of the things that I've observed about like modern day people who have HIV or AIDS, it's still a very taboo topic,
Yes.
and it's still considered like a death sentence. So I wonder how much of like these posters were just so effective in transmitting that message that now you really need these posters like what you have up on the screen now to show that there are treatments and that it doesn't have to be something that we don't talk about, and that being something that isn't openly talked about helps to keep it from being a death sentence.
Right, most of the advertising now is like these. And these are from Trillium Health. And the messages are more positive now for that reason. And the messages in television commercials, it's more open. You can talk about it more. It's a manageable condition. But there is still a stigma. And I think that's a major theme of the symposium. I believe some of the panels are going to deal with the continued stigma. And that's a zone that I can't go into because I'm not a doctor or a scientist in that way. Whereas Bill Valenti he wrote an afterword to the book. He talks all about end the epidemic, and he is much more involved and much more capable than I am to address that, but I do know it remains a stigma. We opened the show with those 4 posters that just get the words AIDS out there. Because especially the early days, simply saying it was a taboo word. Simply putting it in the public realm was something to do. Ronald Reagan didn't say the word AIDS until a press conference in 1985. So talk about a taboo. It was 4 years after the CDC report. He didn't use the word. So just getting the word out in the public realm was something that had to be done, let alone changing the stigma, finding cures, finding remedies, telling you how to get it, how not to get it. Just getting the word out and beating back the taboo of the term was powerful, was necessary. Any more questions? Yes.
Thank you. The word, in my family, the word AIDS was never had negative connotations. I want to go back to your mentioning of Brian White.
Yes.
And perhaps my question is directed not only to you, but also perhaps to Bruce. I remember that quite well, and it was prior to Dr. Atwater's collecting.
Right, it was 87, I think.
I remember it quite well because Life magazine had articles, and Time magazine had a sub-magazine called Week, I think, that had an extensive article in it that I still have lying around somewhere. Despite the tragedy of Ryan White, do you think that tragedy had a lot to do with the change in perception of AIDS globally, or in this country? What effect do you think?
I think it had the effect that it took the stigma away that you can't get AIDS by just being with somebody. It took that, it helped alleviate that stigma, and it pushed it out into the public consciousness.
Agreed.
And the other big one was the death of Rock Hudson. Yep. That was the other big one. That it's not just a small group of people, it's everywhere, it can affect anybody. So I think it was, I believe, and there are scholars of AIDS that know much more than I do from a societal standpoint, I believe it was all helping to destigmatize and to get it out into the public realm as a disease that anybody could get, and that you did not need to fear, there are posters, can you get AIDS from a drinking fountain? Can you get AIDS? The answer is no. And the big one was embracing people, and people were like abandoned in the hospital rooms to die alone because their families didn't want to even come visit them. And that was both for fear of getting AIDS, but also just of the stigma of having a family member who had it, so that people were really ostracized.
Yeah. Well, my recollection was when Ryan White passed away, and that it really had an effect on a lot of the people that I know, their perceptions.
Yeah.
My perception was already beyond that. And but I think his tragedy really is a turning point.
Yes, yeah, it had to be. But the symposium in 2 weeks is going to really be dealing with these issues with people who are AIDS scholars and HIV activists. And I mean, I approached the show, I'm primarily a visual culture curator, I'm a design curator. So I approached it visually and then moved out from there. Others could start from the societal and cultural and medical story and move into the poster. I started with the poster and moved out, which also seemed to make sense because this is an art museum. And then I tried my best to broaden it into the realm of, science. There are doctors who commented on the posters. One of the posters, if you go back, Anthony Fauci, when he wasn't as busy as he is now, was actually commented on one of the posters and the power of watching protesters from ACT UP outside his window at the National Institutes of Health. And he picks a particular poster he remembers seeing and talks about how he's changed his perceptions. So people different with greater skills than mine in that area, we contacted them to comment on the medical, the science, the social. There's an enormous body of research and literature growing around it. It's been 40 years now, at least, since that first, CDC report and that first New York Times article in July. It was July 3rd, 1981 was the Times article. It's been 41 years now.
Yeah.
So a lot has happened.
Yeah. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank you and Jonathan and Jessica, Marianne, and Pam Jackson, a myriad of other people whose names I'll probably never remember, for putting this all together. And,
You're very welcome. Would you identify yourself?
I'm Edward Atwater. I'm the son of Edward Atwater, and he would have been he would have been thrilled. I can see him with his cane going through the exhibition, and I'm just so amazed, and he would have been just thrilled.
Yeah, and Jessica talks about the Woodpecker poster.
Yeah.
Was the last, it's in the show, it was the last one. So we have the first and we have the last,
Yep.
which from a curatorial standpoint is like a big deal.
Yep, yes,
It's what
yes.
curators do.
And,
And
the book, he would have, he didn't live to, have that, sort of, he just sort of started on that at the time. And I want to thank everyone over at RIT for
Well, thank you.
putting that together. But
Yeah, RIT did the book, so it's a local.
He would have been just flabbergasted, and I thank you all.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much.
Watch for this lecture appearing again on the MAG YouTube channel. And this symposium you have mentioned, Donald, several times, along with lots of other events, are on our website associated with this exhibition, so you can catch it all over the course of the next several weeks.
An exhibition can only do so much, and a book does something different with longer scholarly essays. But then these public programs are really a way to get additional perspectives and dialogue going and keep the conversation ongoing. So I urge you to come to that. Jessica and I will be here in a minor role, to sort of like lead tours of the exhibition.
Keep in mind, I know I don't have a mic, but it's really important to recognize that Dr. Atwater had the vision and the foresight to make this collection available digitally when he first gave the collection in 2007. So with Marianne's stewardship and with the River Campus Library's work and investment, we digitized every single one of those posters, and they are available and used all around the world all the time. So keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, thank you.
To me, it's a testament to how important the collection as a whole it is, and it could be done. The exhibition is just a sliver. It could be done a million different ways.
Yeah, it could not have been done without it being digitized, because we couldn't have surveyed it. It's too big. Well, we could have, but I would have been here 6 months. You're welcome.